And we're back at it. So, continuing on with the life story of Mike's, and one of the reasons why I get to live my ass off.com. So, I finished up in radio in about 2003. Is that right? Hold on. So, about 2002. That was a really long run, actually, at the last place I worked at in town, KFMB. And it was one of those deals where at the time I thought, oh my God, I'm getting out of radio, and what am I going to do? It's what I've done my whole life. After I got laid off. After I got let go, I went down to my house in Mexico. Actually, right after I got let go, which was a Friday, because companies always let you go on a Friday, just because it's easier, I guess. I honestly don't know why they do that, but they do. We've done that in our organization, too, that I'm in now. It's like, oh yeah, well, we'll wait till Friday. What? Okay. Anyway, whatever. They did. So, I went to a meeting in Del Mar, where I haven't been in a while, and everyone's like, oh wow, it's good to see you, how you been? I'm like, oh, I'm good, I'm hanging in there, you know. And, so they got around and sharing, and hi, my name is, you know, Mickey. And I lost my job today, and like, half of the room turned around and looked at me, and I'm like, okay, well, you know, people lose their jobs. And I didn't think it was that much of a big deal, but like at least 3 people were like, dude, your job is your life. Like, that's all you do. And I'm like, really? I knew I was committed to my job, and I knew I liked it, and I also knew I was, you know, really into it, and worked long hours, and I also know that I hadn't been going to meetings regularly, and I didn't check in with the sponsor regularly, so I was what's referred to as stark raving sober. So I was not real comfortable in my own skin, but I had a lot of money and a lot of stuff. And I couldn't buy myself happiness, was the short answer. So I thought about that or whatever, and then I thought, well, what am I going to do? I'm like, you know what? For the last, let's see, that was 2002. So for about the last 3 years, I had discovered San Felipe, and I was going down to my house in San Felipe, sometimes like literally every single weekend. So I think I went home and like, I don't know, I may have gone out to dinner with some guys or whatever. I don't recall, actually, but I know that sort of the next stop in my life was to go down to my house in Mexico. So I'm down at my house in Mexico, and I'm looking at my cell phone. And it was one of those deals that when they let me go, they were just like, look, take your cell phone, whatever, we don't want it back. I don't know what, but I was like, yeah, but I'm not going to pay for service on it. You guys have this shitty plan, whatever. The point is that I remember having it with me, and I thought, all right, well, I'm in Mexico. I'm like, I just, you know, I won't bother. I'll just like, I'll kick it off the grid for a while here. And then when I get back into San Diego, I'll like turn it on. And of course, there was a time in 2003, you didn't just cruise down to Mexico and get a SIM at 7-Eleven, pop it into your unlocked phone. I don't even know if you could buy an unlocked phone back then. And then, you know, and then basically go to a kiosk and put 100 pesos in it and no, it was none of that. It was a pain in the ass to get a cell phone in Mexico at that point. It was getting a lot easier, though. Carlos Slim was a very smart man. And he was going to revolutionize the way that people bought cell phone service with the prepaid theory. And everyone told him, you're crazy. No one will prepay for cell service. We have to figure out a way to invoice them monthly at a physical address. Nope. Much more successful with prepay in countries like that. Anyway, so I'm sitting there and staring at my phone. And I was just like so frustrated and out of it, and I was pissed and I was scared because I'm like, how dare they let me go? And at the same time, like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? I mean, for whatever reason, I just didn't feel like, all right, screw them, and then I'll just go down the street and I'll get a job. Maybe not as director of engineering for an entire complex of stations or something like that, like I had in St. Louis, or, you know, in charge of number one, like I was lucky enough to be part of in San Diego. But, you know, I could start as I'll start as an engineer, not maybe even the chief engineer of a station or whatever, and then work up to director, whatever. Regardless, that didn't even occur to me. I was just like, God, I'm like out of radio right now. And there were a couple of, you know, things that sort of motivated me to think that. The first, there were about three of them, and they were technology-wise. The first was the fact that satellite radio had started a few years prior to that, and I was actually a beta tester for XM, and I preferred the technology for XM because if you don't know, XM radio, the way that worked is they had two geosynchronous satellites, which basically means they are satellites that sit above the Earth, essentially above the equator. They sit above the equator the same distance as the circumference of the equator, at the equator, and therefore, because of those two properties, then it will sit up there in geosynchronous orbit without you really having to do anything. So if you don't know, a huge body like the Earth, it creates its own gravity based on its regular rotation. And so because of that, obviously, you and I stick to the Earth. The force due to gravity is because of that, as well as the rotation around the sun. But as part of that, what you get is if you have another body, which is at the altitude or the distance from the surface of said planet or said body rotating, then it sits there too. So anyway, so that's how a geosynchronous satellite works. It's basically at about 25,000 miles-ish above the equator. So the other reason I liked XM is because of those satellites and because they were so far above the equator, and the technology of satellite radio was so new, these engineers, bless their heart, were able to convince the FCC that they needed to be able to license these things with so much power that one satellite could blanket the entire United States at 1.8, 1.7-ish, 1.78, I think, between 1.7 and 1.8 gigahertz of power should the other one fail. And they were like, and we're going to need so much power that we're going to have to ultra power these satellites, which was, the amount of power they put in these satellites was unheard of at that time. It was like 300 times more power than you would put in like something like for Dish Network or DirecTV. Even though those are, you know, arguably, they're about 22 gigahertz. And this is about 1.7. Regardless, they had these superpowered transmitters. And they were also able to convince the FCC, they're like, look, yeah, these may be superpowered and we definitely need that, but it's such new technology and we don't know how it's going to perform, and we're so unclear on how it's going to perform, that we're going to need need to be able to license repeaters in all the major cities, so that when the person goes under a bridge and they're just simply out of view of the satellite, they'll still get coverage. It was genius. And so and so basically wherever you drove around, you got really good XM coverage. And I have XM now, and there's still spots where there's nulls because of their significant interference that spills over into the high 1.7 gig band. But anyway, so but that was, and so they were a lot better, and so I liked them, and I also liked their programming a lot better. Now Sirius, on the other hand, their technology was based on lower, and one little neat fact, if you don't know, the two satellites that XM set up, they called them Rock and Roll. And so they had two satellites for a long time, and each satellite, believe it or not, cost $35 million a month to operate, including all of the people that operated XM, but their run rate was $35 million a month. And I'll tell you why that's an interesting fact and why you think it's a lot of money. It's not a lot of cost. Anyway, so they had 2 satellites, rock and roll. And so as they got bigger and bigger and bigger, generated more revenue, they're like, okay, we need even more satellites. So they got 2 more, so they would have quadruple redundancy. And what do you think they called those? You may know already. Rhythm and blues. So they had rock and roll and rhythm and blues. Cool, right? And so those are their 4 satellites. And by contrast, the way that Sirius started is they had low Earth orbit satellites. And if you don't know, the way low Earth orbit satellites work is they actually go around the Earth one time every 24 hours, but they go north to south. And so they would go, and I believe there was 4 of them minimum at the time. And so, actually, I think there's more than that. But at the end of the day, because it took 24, or maybe it's 12 hours, low Earth orbit satellites. I'm actually not sure. I'll have to check on that. Anyway, in the course of at least 12, if not 24, the satellite will go around from north to south along certain longitudes, and it'll circle the Earth. And if you think about it, that's actually an even better long-term play, because you could be like, yeah, and not only can we provide satellite radio service for the United States, that satellite's going to be on the other side of the world and be able to provide satellite radio service over there. And they're not licensed for that, but technically they could. But the downside is, depending upon where you were and if the conditions were right, then you would lose coverage to Sirius satellites frequently. So I'd be driving along. In fact, okay, so I was a beta tester for XM in my, I think at the time I had a Range Rover. It was an older one, but it was a Range Rover, and it was one of those deals where it sat on the dash, and I played the audio through. I think it was actually a cassette player I had, because the radio in the dash was so old, to convert the audio out of the receiver. But it had this special cable, big ass antenna, so actually it got really decent coverage. Much bigger than the antennas you see on the top of the cars now, which are kind of like a shark fin. And if you don't know, those antennas actually, they do 2 purposes. They use the insides of that for GPS mainly, meaning that's the majority of the electronics in there, and then the other is Sirius, XM or Sirius satellite radio. Anyway, and I tell you all of this because it was a new technology, and it was the standard deal where the naysayers, people that aren't into change and skeptical about it, were like, there's no way people are going to pay for radio when they can get it for free. And of course, the free means you tolerate listening to 5 to 7 minutes worth of 30 to 60 second commercial spots, commercials. In order to be able to tolerate that, you basically get radio for free, and then you can listen to the song that's coming up after the ads. And if you don't know, when you work in commercial radio, the programming you have, meaning the music or whatever, that's just the filler in between revenue generation. So the songs that radio stations play, I love this one radio station, their slogan was, "It's all about the music." I'm like, right, bro, that pays the electric bill. Do you have any idea what the electric bill is for an FM transmitter every week? But it, obviously the highest cost to any business is the staff, the human, the salaries. But the electric bill isn't free either. But nonetheless, yeah, it might have been interesting to play music, and that part was about the music. But trust me, it was all about playing the commercials in between the music. So you made it good music so people would listen to the commercials. But anyway, so it was a time when I thought to myself, okay, well, of all the times to be kicked out of radio, basically, better now than then. And as the months, months initially were like, oh my God, you're gone. My buddies that I worked with there, and then couple of the guys that worked for me, they were like, oh my God, this sucks. The guy that they had to replace you, he's such an asshole. He's he's not technically competent. He's not a good engineer. He's not a good boss. And those guys had worked for me for like over 5 years. And actually, when I was first their boss, I wasn't a good boss. But I learned how to be a good boss because I learned that the amount of leverage you get from being a very supportive leader is infinitely more than you get from smacking your employees, right? The beatings will continue until morale improves. I learned very quickly that that is a horrible way to lead. You don't get anything accomplished. And, you know, so a culture based on trust and respect. And I was able to hire this one guy who worked for me the longest time, though I still am even friends with today. His name's Chip. He was an awesome engineer, and he and I had many passions outside of radio. So we both really liked radio. He grew up in it as well, working for Mexican stations. Actually, he was an engineer, and then worked where I left for a while, and then transitioned to working in higher ed. Interestingly enough, as do I in IT and higher ed. So who knows? Maybe it's the standard path for radio engineers. So anyway, so I'm sitting there in Mexico and thinking to myself, okay, well, this isn't such a bad thing, because like there's this Sirius and XM satellite radio thing coming, and this Napster thing had come out a few years before that, and so internet radio was catching on, and nobody could predict where that was going to go, and anyone who had predictions was wrong. But you know, you could easily predict that, hey, eventually people are going to pay for satellite radio. So I was like, this isn't going to be so bad. So it was actually a good time in my life, and as I was sitting there staring at my cell phone on the mesa of my quarter of an acre that I was renting with this 3,000 square foot house I had that cost me $1,500 a year in Mexico, I was like, you know what, I'm done. And I took the radio and I took the cell phone. I looked at it, and I think I either said out loud, but I know I thought out loud, like, oh my God, I've been on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for 10 years straight. Even when I would be on vacation, I would get called and I would be on call. Not only would I be on call, I would get called. It's one thing, I'm on call now 24 hours a day. I get called once every 6 months. I mean, everything's more reliable and things work a lot better nowadays. But nonetheless, and I took the phone and I just chucked it into the Sea of Cortez, into the beach, into the water that was right in front of my house. And I'm like, that's it, man, I'm done. And then I just literally crashed down there for like 2 weeks. And I'll leave you with one final thing. The reason I said it costs $35 million a month to operate XM satellite radio, and you think, oh my God, that's a lot of money. So pretty much the minimum someone pays for satellite radio is $10 a month. There are people that pay $14 and $17, but let's say for the sake of argument, it's $10 a month. There are 30 million subscribers per XM and Sirius. So if you were to take, and by now, like, the cost of operating those satellites is almost none. I mean, it's a sunk cost now because the satellites are deployed, and they basically, after 10 years, it basically costs nothing to operate them. It certainly doesn't cost. But to operate, and then both of those companies combined, and so they have all that. But let's say, for the sake of argument, it costs 50. Let's say it costs $100 million to even operate, which it doesn't. It's more like closer to still $35 million for both companies, because the program originates from the same spot, and then it just goes to both services. But so let's say it costs $50 million a month. There's 30 million subscribers, plus or minus. They go up and down all the time. But let's say at least 30 million, paying $10 a month. That's $300 million in revenue every month that they're generating. So when people are like, oh my God, I can't believe they're paying Howard Stern $1 million. Trust me, they've got the cash. I mean, dude, people don't understand the amount of profit that is available in broadcast. When I was in radio, the radio station I worked at, our morning show, each of the morning show guys, each made $1 million in salary a year. And they'd be like, oh my God, that's so much money, I can't believe those guys get paid, blah, 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 blah. I won't go through the numbers, but I can tell you that in 2 weeks of running commercials for that morning show, we would generate $1 million in revenue. In 4 weeks, we would generate enough money to pay for the entire morning show for the entire year. So the morning talent, the producer, the people, including my salary, that's for sure, roll that up into there. So it was 11 months of sheer profit for that morning show. So when people were like, I can't believe they pay those guys $1 million a year, I'm like, you know what, dude? If they kicked the door in right now and said, I'm going to kill myself on the air and use the F word 10 times every hour until you pay me X amount of money, they couldn't now. But back then, they absolutely could have extorted, and they would have been like, okay, I'll pay you $5 million a year. So we only make 7 months of sheer profit. I mean, dude, when I was in radio, at the height of radio, the FM station I was working at, we were generating $22 million in revenue a month, buddy. $22 million a month on the radio. Imagine what we were doing in TV. Serious, serious money. You're not making even half that today. You're not even making a quarter of that today. So XM took over, Napster took over, and all of the flavors of other stuff that's available. I mean, obviously, there's only really one XM Sirius solution now called satellite radio, XM Sirius. And you can get everything online. But yeah, so it was ending. And so that kind of started me on, okay, well, what am I going to do next? So that's what I'll touch on next. I love you guys. I'm glad you're listening. I hope this adds value. Talk to you soon. Ciao.